Hey there! Welcome back to my web series. As promised, I wanted to make a video about the protests that I discussed very briefly in my last video about integration. These protests are the Fees Must Fall movement. If you don't know about it, I'm going to explain a little bit about it, but you should also educate yourself and just do some web surfing to know more about the basics. I was in Cape Town the second semester of the academic year. Which might sound a little weird because it was from July to November, which is usually the first semester of an American school year, but that in South Africa is the second semester. During the same academic year, before the semester that I was in Cape Town, there was a big movement to remove the statue of Cecil John Rhodes from UCT's campus. So Cecil John Rhodes has a big history of colonialism in South Africa, and to have a statue of him on UCT's campus where a lot of black and colored students attend was seen as very disrespectful and kind of just senseless to keep it there. So a lot of students who formed the group Rhodes Must Fall were protesting the statue and wanted to get it removed, and it eventually was removed from campus. However, it was not destroyed, it was just moved to a different storing facility. And now, instead of having anything on there, it's just, there's nothing on the podium that he was kind of placed. However, there is like a kind of mural or drawing on the ground of his shadow. So the thought of him is still there, it still exists on that campus, especially since this protest movement didn't just happen overnight. You know, it took a long time for this statue to be removed, and there was opposition. There was a lot of racism and backlash against this movement to get the statue removed, and I learned about this kind of from just like Facebook posts before I got there, and obviously from people who were involved once I did arrive in Cape Town. When I arrived in Cape Town, it was still a very relevant topic. It hadn't gone out of conversation just because the statue had been removed. This was kind of seen as a beginning for this movement to decolonize UCT and start the conversation about what that means in terms of how we frame language, how we frame our thoughts, how we frame classes. I talked a little bit in my previous video about language requirements in schools, which kind of follow apartheid mindsets because they require students who come from non-English speaking or Afrikaans speaking households to learn these languages. So just thinking about all these things, and it was really amazing to me to see the passion and dedication that these activists gave to that and to the conversation around decolonization of the university. A lot of movements did sprout from that, a lot of different conversations on campus, a lot of roundtables hosted, a lot of awareness trying to be raised about these issues, and giving voices to people who didn't have them before and couldn't speak up before. In the later half of my semester there was a proposed fee increase, so a proposed tuition increase for UCT and for a lot of different universities across South Africa. This sparked a lot of outrage because it paid no mind to the students who had been paying these fees and had been newly admitted to the university after years and years of systematically being excluded from academic spaces because of apartheid and because of apartheid legislation. And it didn't promote integration at all, which is what you would hope a post-apartheid South Africa would try to promote. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. So a lot of people were very angered by this proposed fee increase, and a movement was born from Rhodes Must Fall, from a lot of the organizers of Rhodes Must Fall, into Fees Must Fall. So the same kind of rhetoric, but a different kind of focus. Not a different issue, because decolonization was still included in all these conversations. A lot of the same topics and focus areas from Roads Must Fall, but just a different objective of trying to not have the government raise these fees, which were already unattainable for a lot of students who were attending these schools. So a lot of protests broke out over this issue on campuses across South Africa. At UCT, school was actually shut down for a while because people were barricading the entrances to bring this into immediacy, since they thought that just kind of protesting on campus would not really bring it to the attention of the administration. And obviously by shutting down school, it did bring it to the attention of the administration. And it was also discussed a lot in classes as well. So my African literature class, we definitely talked about the narratives that inspire movements like this, what kind of background drives the movement. And I think the fact that professors chose to discuss those things was great, but also it wasn't great that it was a topic that was being discussed, because it meant that all these people were very unhappy and felt unheard and erased. These protests also were not entirely peaceful, but that wasn't only because of the people who were protesting. There was a lot of police brutality from the videos that I would see online. They were all over social media. And it was interesting for me to watch as an outsider, because I didn't really have a place in these protests. It wasn't my place to like have an opinion, really. I was just supposed to exist in this space and let people express their opinions who were not able to do that for so long. I talked a little bit in my classes video about having discussions about colonialism and South African politics, and kind of trying to stray away from taking over that space, because I am an American, I'm not South African, and I'm making this video right now just as a summary of what I saw. This is not a reflection of every single person in the movement, the opposition to the movement. This is just what I saw and what I gathered. One of the most important things I learned from being exposed to this movement and having discussions with other people who knew a lot more about it than I did was to be open to making mistakes in your language, and being aware that if someone tells you, hey, that's not okay to say, or that's not actually correct, or you're kind of monopolizing the conversation, for you to take a step back and say, okay, like, I need to examine my own opinions and see why that might be problematic, and why I need to make space for people who have the right to speak about this and have the right to be angry and have an opinion. It was interesting for me to connect all of these narratives and protests and actions to things I'd seen in the US, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the Yes All Women movement. There are so many different parts that I saw that were connected to my own experience, but it wasn't my experience. Those are things that are happening right now in Cape Town that I cannot relate to completely because they don't apply to me, and I need to let the people who it does apply to have the space to process and discuss and take action in whatever way they understand. Jacob Zuma, the South African president, eventually announced that there would be no fee increases for the next academic year, so the one that is happening right now. He didn't say anything about future years, so it was kind of received as a small victory from what I saw on social media and in the conversations that I had with people. But there was still an attitude that a lot needed to be done and that the fight was not over, especially since there was no guarantee that something like this wouldn't happen again in the future. I think the most unsettling thing for me to have seen was the way that people connected these protests and demonstrations and actions to protests during apartheid. It was eye-opening for me because I visited the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg during a week that there were a lot of protests. And it was the day that Jacob Zuma announced that there would be no fee increases, and I was in this museum where they were showing videos of protesters being arrested and beaten, and there was tear gas being thrown, and there were also stun grenades, and these were all things that were going on for the Fees Must Fall protests. It was very unsettling to watch those videos in a museum that had been commemorating this very, very oppressive period of time in South African history, and then check Twitter and see almost the exact same thing, almost the exact same pictures, the same videos of people that I knew and had interacted with in my classes. There were a lot of connections made between these protests and the Soweto uprising, and to have that comparison even be remotely valid was very scary. And to me, I say it's scary, but I can't even imagine what it's like for somebody who's living there and whose life is concerned with these tuition increases or this history of oppression. But by far the most unsettling part of this experience for me, and I say unsettling, but I don't really have a license to claim that term at all in this situation, was coming back to the US or talking to people from the US and them having absolutely no knowledge of the situation. I had to explain this to a lot of different people, and it felt weird to me because I didn't really know that much or have a big background, but because it was part of my experience, I did explain it to them, and a lot of times it was met with very shallow responses that were so weird to me because on one hand, there was this part of the world that I had a connection to that was experiencing so much hurt and injustice, and on the other hand, there were people that were living their lives not even knowing that it was going on. It's not entirely those people's fault for not knowing about this because you're exposed to what the media tells you and what the people around you tell you. So I'm coming in from Cape Town, where I knew people who were going through these protests and seeing it on social media, but those people back home were not seeing that. At the same time, it's frustrating because I wish that they did know, and I wish that more people cared about learning about this conflict, especially since so much of history that we learn in American schools is so westernized. You know, we don't learn about South Africa and apartheid and the history of oppression in those parts of the world. So wherever you go, whether you're studying abroad or just visiting, I encourage you to really learn about these things and read the news from different standpoints, not just CNN or BBC, but local news outlets. And social media now is just so big because so much is concealed from the news, so much is censored, and it's interesting to get both sides from people who are experiencing whatever conflict is going on and then what the media is presenting. And it's very tricky to talk about these things because a lot of times when you say, yeah, there are these protests going on or this event is happening, people will use language that doesn't really represent the situation. A lot of times when people would reach out to me who did know about what was going on, they'd say, wow, that's so inspiring and so exciting. It was weird because it's not exciting. It's not exciting that people are so outraged at something that their government has done that they feel they need to take this action. And it might be inspiring to see how dedicated they are, but that's really not the right language to use because it's not a choice for some people, it's just necessary, because if they don't protest this, if they don't raise their voices about what they think of these fee increases, that might mean that they don't get to go to school. And that to me is not something that people should talk about as inspiring. It's not a choice, it's something that is unfortunately happening and that people are taking action on because they don't see another option. So I hope that this video motivated you to learn more about this conflict and more about news that isn't happening in Western parts of the world. It's definitely important to be proactive about those things, especially since what's presented to us isn't always accurate or correct or shows the whole situation. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time.